Working the night shift at a hospital changes the way you see the world. You become comfortable walking silent hallways at 3 in the morning, hearing machines beep in empty corridors, and riding elevators through buildings where people are born and where others take their final breath. I thought I'd grown used to all of it. Then one night, I looked into a reflection and realized someone had been standing inside an empty elevator with me the entire time. You're listening to True Haunting Log, where we share real haunted incidents from real people around the globe. If you've experienced something you can't explain, send your story to truehauntinglog@gmail.com. Story 1. The Smiling Boy in the Elevator. This happened while I was working the night shift at a hospital in South Carolina, USA, a couple of months ago. I've gone back and forth about sharing it because, even now, I can't fully explain what I saw. It lasted only a few seconds, but those few seconds changed the way I look at elevators forever. If you've never worked nights in a hospital, it's difficult to describe just how different the building feels after midnight. During the day, every hallway is filled with doctors, nurses, visitors, ringing phones, and constant conversation. At night, everything slows down. The fluorescent lights remain just as bright, but the silence becomes almost overwhelming. You begin noticing sounds that disappear during the daytime: the distant hum of air conditioning units, the soft beeping of heart monitors from patient rooms, the squeak of a lone cleaning cart somewhere down an empty corridor, and occasionally the low mechanical rumble of an elevator moving between floors. Because of my job, I spend a ridiculous amount of time riding those elevators. Our hospital has 2 separate sets. One is located in the main lobby for visitors, while the other is reserved almost exclusively for employees transporting equipment, medications, or moving quickly between departments. During a typical shift, I probably ride those elevators dozens of times without thinking about it. They had become so routine that I could practically navigate the building without looking at the floor numbers anymore. That particular night had been unusually quiet. Quiet shifts always sound appealing to people who don't work in hospitals, but anyone who actually does knows they often feel the strangest. There are long periods where nothing seems to happen, followed by brief moments of frantic activity before everything falls silent again. Around 2:30 in the morning, I just finished helping on the 2nd floor and was heading back down to the 1st floor using the employee elevators. The elevator ride itself was completely ordinary. The doors closed. The familiar vibration began beneath my feet. The floor indicator slowly counted downward. There wasn't another person inside with me. I remember that clearly because I'd entered the elevator alone and hadn't stopped on any other floor during the descent. I even leaned casually against the side wall while checking a message on my phone before slipping it back into my pocket as the elevator approached the 1st floor. When the doors opened, I stepped out into the hallway without giving it another thought. Directly across from the employee elevators sits a small circular waiting area with several chairs positioned in front of tall floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking an enclosed courtyard. Even in the middle of the night, the area is softly illuminated by exterior lights reflecting off the glass. I've walked past it hundreds of times. As I stepped out of the elevator, something immediately caught my attention. Someone appeared to be sitting in one of the chairs. At least, I thought someone was sitting there. The figure looked slightly distorted because of the reflections in the glass. For a split second, I assumed I was simply seeing another employee waiting for someone, or perhaps a patient's family member resting during a difficult night. That wasn't unusual. Then something about the image stopped making sense. The person didn't seem to be sitting in front of the window. The reflection looked deeper, almost as though I wasn't looking at someone beyond the glass. I was looking at a reflection inside it. I slowed my pace. My brain tried to make sense of what my eyes were seeing. For another second, I actually convinced myself I must somehow be looking through a patient room window. Then I immediately realized that couldn't possibly be true. There weren't any patient rooms on that side of the building. There never had been. That's when my stomach tightened. Because if the figure wasn't outside the window, and it wasn't inside a room, then there was only one place the reflection could have come from: the elevator behind me. The realization hit me so suddenly that I stopped walking. The figure wasn't in front of me. It was reflected in the window from somewhere behind me. More specifically, inside the elevator I'd just stepped out of. For a fraction of a second, my mind refused to accept it. It tried forcing the image into something ordinary. Maybe another employee had slipped into the elevator just before the doors closed. Maybe someone had been crouching down to tie their shoe. Maybe I simply hadn't noticed them during the ride. But every one of those explanations collapsed almost immediately. I knew I'd entered the elevator alone. The elevator hadn't stopped between the second and first floors. No one had stepped inside, and if another employee had somehow been standing behind me, I would have heard them or at least felt their presence in such a small space. Instead, I'd been completely alone, or at least, I thought I had. Without fully understanding why, I slowly turned my head toward the elevator before the doors could finish closing. The entire moment couldn't have lasted more than 3 seconds, yet my memory of it has never faded. Crouched behind the section of the elevator where the control panel was located was a teenage boy. He wasn't sitting, he wasn't kneeling. He was crouched low against the wall as though he'd been hiding there the entire ride. He looked about 17 or 18 years old. His hair was short and blonde, neatly cut, as though he'd gotten it trimmed only recently. He wore faded blue jeans and what appeared to be a dark-colored shirt, although I honestly can't remember exactly what color it was. Everything happened too quickly for details like that to register. What I remember perfectly was his face. He wasn't frightened. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even looking surprised that I'd finally noticed him. He was smiling, not a wide grin, not an exaggerated horror movie smile, just a small, calm smile. The kind someone gives when they've been quietly watching another person for a long time. Our eyes met. I can't explain why that terrified me more than if he'd been screaming. There wasn't a trace of emotion behind that smile. No warmth, no friendliness, no recognition. Just calm amusement. Before I could react, the elevator doors slid together between us. The smile disappeared behind the closing metal doors. The familiar mechanical hum returned as the elevator continued on its way to another floor. I remained frozen, exactly where I was. For several seconds, I couldn't convince my legs to move. Every logical part of my brain immediately began searching for an explanation. Maybe another employee had been playing some kind of joke. Maybe I'd somehow misinterpreted the reflection. Maybe exhaustion from working nights had caused my eyes to play tricks on me. I wanted any of those explanations to be true. Finally, I pressed the call button. The elevator returned within seconds. The doors opened. It was empty. Completely empty. No teenager. No one hiding behind the control panel. No sign that anyone had been inside at all. I stepped cautiously into the elevator and looked toward the exact corner where I'd seen him. There wasn't enough room for anyone to hide. The control panel only projected slightly from the wall. A person crouching there would still be clearly visible from almost anywhere inside the elevator. I stood there for nearly a minute, replaying the previous few seconds over and over in my head. And then I did something I'd never done before. I rode the elevator back to the second floor. Not because I needed to, because I wanted to prove to myself that I'd imagined the entire thing. The doors opened. Nobody was waiting. Nobody entered. I rode back down again. Empty. Again. By the time my shift ended that morning, I'd used those same elevators another dozen times. Nothing else happened. No strange reflections. No smiling teenager. No unexplained passengers. As daylight streamed through the hospital windows, I almost managed to convince myself that fatigue had caused a brief visual mistake. Almost. Then, just before leaving for home, I caught myself walking past the employee elevators. Without thinking, I looked into the reflection on the courtyard windows. Not because I expected to see him again, because I realized I was suddenly afraid of what might be standing behind me. For the next few days, I tried convincing myself that what I'd seen had been nothing more than exhaustion. Anyone who has worked permanent night shifts knows how easily your body can become confused after weeks of irregular sleep. Your eyes play tricks on you. Shadows look like people. Reflections seem to move when they shouldn't. I kept repeating those explanations to myself because they were comforting. The problem was, I couldn't stop replaying that smile. It wasn't frightening because it looked unnatural. It was frightening because it looked completely natural. Whoever or whatever I had seen hadn't looked angry or threatening. The teenager had simply been crouching there as though he'd been patiently waiting for me to notice him. If his expression had been twisted or frightening, I probably could have dismissed it as my imagination creating a horror movie image. Instead, the face had looked perfectly ordinary. That somehow made it much worse. Over the following week, every time I used the employee elevators, I found myself developing a new habit. Before stepping out, I'd glance into the polished stainless steel walls or toward the reflection in the elevator doors. Then, after exiting, I'd immediately look toward the courtyard windows. Every single time. I never consciously decided to do it. My body simply did it on its own. Nothing unusual happened. The elevators carried staff between floors exactly as they always had. Nurses hurried in and out. Housekeeping staff pushed carts through the hallways. Patients were transported to imaging, surgery, and recovery. Everything continued normally. Yet something about those elevators no longer felt ordinary. Around a week later, I was chatting with one of the older nurses during a quiet part of the night. We'd both worked enough overnight shifts together that conversations naturally drifted towards strange experiences in the hospital. Hospitals have a way of collecting stories. Every long-term employee seems to know someone who's heard footsteps in empty corridors, watched call lights activate inside vacant rooms, or seen silhouettes at the end of hallways that disappeared before anyone reached them. Usually, we laughed those stories off. That night, for reasons I still don't understand, I mentioned my experience. I kept it simple. I thought I saw someone inside the elevator last week. The nurse looked at me for a moment. "Employee elevator?" she asked. I nodded. "First floor?" Again, I nodded. She didn't laugh. She didn't even look surprised. Instead, she quietly asked, "Young guy?" The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I hadn't mentioned an age. I hadn't described anyone. Yet she'd guessed immediately. I asked how she knew. She shrugged. "I've never seen him," she said. "But I've heard people talk about a blonde teenage boy around those elevators for years." For a second, I honestly thought she was joking. She wasn't smiling. She simply continued preparing medication as though we were discussing the weather. According to her, the stories weren't common, but every few years someone working nights would mention catching sight of a teenage boy in reflections near the employee elevators. Nobody ever claimed he spoke. Nobody reported being harmed. Most people only saw him for a second or two before he disappeared. Some employees believed it was nothing more than fatigue. Others refused to talk about it at all. I asked whether anyone knew who the boy supposedly was. She shook her head. No idea. That answer stayed with me far longer than I expected. Not because it proved anything, it didn't. Hospitals are full of rumors. People repeat stories. Once you've heard them, it's easy for your imagination to recreate them. But there was one detail that continued bothering me. I'd never heard any of those stories before that conversation. When I saw the teenager, I didn't know there was supposed to be one. The following month, I continued working my normal schedule. Life went on. Eventually, the experience faded into the background of my memory, until one quiet night, around 3 in the morning. I stepped into the same employee elevator alone, pressed the button for the second floor, and just before the doors closed, I caught myself checking the reflection behind me. The elevator was empty. I actually laughed at myself. The doors shut. The elevator began rising, halfway between floors. It stopped. Not because someone had called it. Not because the doors opened. It simply stopped. The lights flickered once. Then everything became completely still. For the first time since that night, I wasn't thinking about the reflection anymore. I was wondering whether, this time, I was trapped inside the elevator with whatever had smiled at me weeks earlier. The elevator stopped so suddenly that I instinctively looked up at the floor indicator. There wasn't a number. The display had gone completely blank. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered once before, settling into a dull, steady glow. The familiar mechanical hum that usually filled the elevator disappeared, replaced by absolute silence. Even after years of working in hospitals, I'd never experienced an elevator simply stop between floors without an alarm sounding. I pressed the door open button. Nothing happened. I pressed it again. Still nothing. My first thought was that the elevator had experienced a mechanical fault. Hospitals perform regular maintenance, but like any machine, elevators occasionally malfunction. I reached for the emergency intercom, already preparing to report that I was stuck between floors. Before pressing the button, I caught my own reflection in the polished stainless steel doors. For one brief moment, I hesitated. Then I looked behind me. The elevator was empty. I let out a slow breath. I hadn't realized I was holding. "You getting into your own head?" I muttered quietly. As soon as the words left my mouth, the elevator gave a soft jolt. The floor indicator lit back up. The motor hummed to life. A second later, the doors opened onto the second floor, as though nothing had happened. I stepped out almost immediately. One of the nurses was walking past the elevators carrying a clipboard. "Everything okay?" she asked. I nodded automatically. "Yeah." Elevator just paused for a second. She glanced toward the elevator doors. "They've been serviced recently," she replied. "Probably just resetting." It sounded perfectly reasonable. I wanted to believe her. The rest of the shift passed without incident, but from that night onward, I noticed something I couldn't ignore. Whenever I rode that particular elevator alone during the early hours of the morning, I always found myself standing in exactly the same place. Never near the control panel, never with my back fully turned toward that corner. Without consciously deciding to, I'd begun positioning myself where I could always see every part of the elevator in front of me. Weeks turned into months. The strange encounters slowly became one of those stories I rarely thought about unless someone else mentioned ghosts or hospitals. Then one night, something happened that brought everything rushing back. I was walking through the first floor corridor toward the employee elevators after finishing another task upstairs. It was around 3 in the morning again, one of those unusually quiet nights when the hospital almost felt abandoned. The circular waiting area opposite the elevators was empty, and the courtyard outside lay completely still beneath the security lights. As I approached the elevator doors, I noticed movement in the reflection of the windows. Someone appeared to be standing inside the elevator. I immediately looked toward the actual doors. They were closed. No arrival chime. No movement. No indication that an elevator had reached the floor. I looked back at the window. The reflection was gone. At that exact moment, ding, the elevator doors opened. Empty. No one stepped out. I stood there for several seconds without moving. Finally, another employee rounded the corner pushing a supply cart. Without saying a word, I stepped into the elevator with them. For the first time since the original encounter, I realized I no longer wanted to ride that elevator alone. Nothing unusual happened during the ride. When we reached the second floor, the employee wheeled the cart out while I remained inside, continuing upward to another department. As the doors closed again, I caught myself staring at the polished metal wall opposite me. My own reflection stared back. Then, for the briefest instant, I thought I saw another reflection lower down near the control panel. Not clearly, just the outline of someone crouching. I spun around so quickly that my shoulder hit the handrail. The elevator was empty. When I looked back at the wall, only my own reflection remained. I didn't ride another elevator alone for the rest of that shift. After that night, my relationship with those elevators changed completely. I still had to use them. My job depended on moving quickly between floors, and taking the stairs every single time simply wasn't practical. But something inside me had changed. What had once been nothing more than another part of my nightly routine had become the one place in the hospital where I was never completely comfortable. Without realizing it, I developed little habits. If another employee was waiting nearby, I'd let them ride with me instead of going alone. If I had to use the elevator by myself, I'd stand facing the doors instead of turning sideways. And every single time the doors opened on the first floor, my eyes immediately drifted toward the reflection in the tall courtyard windows before I looked anywhere else. I never consciously decided to do it. It simply became instinct. Months passed, and I never saw the smiling teenager again. At least, not directly. Every now and then, I'd catch something from the corner of my eye, a reflection that seemed to move just a fraction too late, or what looked like someone standing near the control panel until I turned my head and found the elevator completely empty. Those moments lasted less than a second, and each time I convinced myself it was nothing more than fatigue or my imagination replaying an experience that had frightened me. Maybe that's exactly what it was. I honestly don't know. One evening, while waiting for the elevator with a maintenance technician, I casually asked whether the employee elevators ever experienced strange electrical problems. He laughed and said they occasionally had minor faults like any other elevator, but nothing unusual enough to concern him. Then, almost jokingly, he added, "People are always blaming ghosts when it's usually just old equipment." I smiled. I didn't tell him that faulty equipment couldn't explain what I'd seen reflected in the courtyard glass. Several weeks later, I found myself walking through that same first-floor corridor just before sunrise. My shift was almost over, and daylight was beginning to filter through the tall windows overlooking the courtyard. For the first time in months, the hospital felt peaceful again. Nurses were changing shifts, housekeeping staff had begun their morning rounds, and the building slowly came back to life. As I passed the waiting area, I stopped without really knowing why. The courtyard windows reflected the hallway behind me perfectly. Empty corridor, empty elevators, nothing unusual. I remember thinking that maybe it was finally over. Maybe enough time had passed for me to let the whole experience go. I turned to leave. Then I noticed something in the reflection. The employee elevator doors behind me had begun closing. I hadn't heard them open. I hadn't heard anyone step inside, yet just before the doors met, I saw someone crouched in the exact same corner beside the control panel. Short blonde hair, blue jeans, and that same small, calm smile. I spun around instantly. The elevator doors were already closed. Without thinking, I pressed the call button. A few seconds later, the elevator returned. The door slid open, empty. I slowly stepped inside and looked toward the corner where I'd seen him. Nothing, no one hiding, no sign that anyone had been there. I stood quietly for several moments before finally stepping back out into the hallway. That was the last time I ever tried to find an explanation. I've never claimed I saw a ghost. I can't prove that I did. Maybe exhaustion caused me to misread a reflection. Maybe stress after years of working nights affected my perception for a few brief seconds. I genuinely hope one of those explanations is true. But there's one detail I've never been able to explain. The very first time I saw that teenager. I hadn't looked directly at him. I only noticed him because of a reflection, and every time I thought I saw him again after that, it was always in a reflection first, never standing openly in front of me, never walking through the hallway, always behind me, always somewhere I wasn't supposed to be looking. Even today, I still work nights, I still ride elevators, I still pass polished windows and stainless steel doors every shift, but I've developed one habit that I don't think I'll ever break. Whenever the elevator doors open, I always check the reflection before I step out. Not because I expect to see that smiling teenage boy again, but because, if he's ever standing behind me, I'd rather notice him in the reflection than turn around and find him there in person. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe to True Haunting Log so you never miss another real haunted encounter. If you've experienced something unexplained while working a night shift in a hospital or inside an elevator, send your true story to truehauntinglog@gmail.com. And before you go, tell us in the comments, if you saw someone smiling at you in an elevator reflection, would you press the button to open the doors again, or would you walk away?